At the foot of Mount Sinai, Israel committed the first great breach of the covenant. While Moses was on the mountain receiving the law, the people melted down their gold and fashioned a calf. They violated the first 2 commandments before the tablets were even delivered. God's response was immediate and structural. He told Moses that he would destroy the entire population and restart the covenant through Moses alone, effectively making Moses the new Abraham. But Moses intervened with a legal argument. He reminded God of the unconditional oath sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then he made a second point about reputation. If Israel is destroyed in the wilderness, Moses argued, the Egyptians will conclude that the God who brought them out lacked either the power or the intent to finish what he started. They will say, he brought them out with evil purpose. God relented. The people were spared. But the incident revealed something critical. The people were stiff-necked. The law could be written on stone, but the internal nature of the people remained unchanged. This was the first data point in a pattern that would repeat for centuries. For the next several hundred years, Israel's history was marked by continuous rebellion. Ezekiel later reviewed this history in chapter 20 of his book and concluded that the rebellion was not occasional but systemic. From Egypt onward, the people repeatedly rejected God's statutes. They worshipped idols. They ignored the Sabbath. They profaned the name. By the time of the Babylonian siege in 586 before the Common Era, the situation had reached a terminal point. Ezekiel witnessed something no one thought possible. The glory of God, the visible manifestation of his presence, departed from the temple. It rose from the Holy of Holies, paused at the threshold, moved to the eastern gate, and then left the city entirely. This was not a metaphor. It was a documented exit. God could not remain where his name was being actively profaned by idolatry and injustice. The exile that followed was not a failure of God's plan. It was a tactical shift. According to Ezekiel chapter 36, God scattered Israel among the nations as an act of judgment. But this scattering created an unintended consequence. The nations looked at the exiled Jews and drew the wrong conclusion. They said, "These are the people of the Lord," and yet they had to leave his land. The implication was clear. Either their God was too weak to protect them, or he had abandoned them. This was a global misunderstanding of God's character and power. The name of God was being profaned not by Israel's sin alone, but by the nation's interpretation of Israel's punishment. God decided to act, but not for Israel's sake. Ezekiel records God saying, "It is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I am about to act, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations. The nations will know that I am the Lord, when through you I vindicate my holiness before their eyes." The restoration plan had specific technical components. First, God would gather the people physically from all the nations and bring them back to their land. Second, he would cleanse them from their idols. Third, and most importantly, he would perform what Ezekiel called an upheaval of Israel's nature. The heart of stone, the stubborn internal aspect that had been present since Sinai, would be removed and replaced with a heart of flesh. Fourth, God would place his own spirit within them so that they would finally be able to walk in his statutes. This was the solution to the problem that began at the golden calf. The law on stone could command behavior, but it could not change the heart. The new covenant would address the internal problem directly, but the plan did not end with restoration. Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39 describe a final confrontation. After Israel has been regathered and is living securely in the land, a massive coalition of nations will invade. The leader of this coalition is called Gog, from the land of Magog. The invading force includes Persia, Cush, Put, and other distant peoples. They come from the far north. Gog looks at the restored Israel and sees a wealthy, peaceful people living in unwalled villages. He decides to attack out of greed and ambition. But God reveals that this invasion is not happening outside his control. God says, "I will bring you against my land, that the nations may know me, when through you, O Gog, I vindicate my holiness before their eyes." Gog thinks he is acting on his own initiative, but he is being drawn into a confrontation that will serve as the final public demonstration of God's power. The battle itself is one-sided. God does not allow Israel to win through military strength. Instead, he intervenes directly. There is a great earthquake. The mountains are thrown down. Gog's armies turn on each other in confusion. Pestilence and bloodshed sweep through the ranks. Torrential rains, hailstones, fire, and sulfur fall from the sky. The invading coalition is annihilated on the mountains of Israel. The cleanup takes 7 months. The weapons left behind provide fuel for 7 years. This is not a close victory. It is an overwhelming supernatural intervention designed to be unmistakable. The purpose of this event is stated repeatedly. God says, "I will set my glory among the nations, and all the nations shall see my judgment that I have executed, and my hand that I have laid on them. The house of Israel shall know that I am the Lord their God from that day forward. And the nations shall know that the house of Israel went into captivity for their iniquity, because they dealt treacherously with me." The entire arc of history from Sinai to the defeat of Gog serves a single purpose. The knowledge of who God is must be established publicly and undeniably. Israel's suffering was not random. Their exile was not evidence of God's weakness. Their restoration is not their own doing. And their final deliverance from Gog will prove to the entire world that the God of Israel is sovereign. This is the answer to the question that has haunted Jewish history. Why have the chosen people been persecuted? Why has their history been marked by exile, scattering, and hatred? Ezekiel provides the theological answer. The exile was permitted so that God's name would be carried into the nations. The hatred was allowed so that the final confrontation could occur. And the final battle will happen so that God can vindicate his holiness in a way that cannot be ignored or reinterpreted. At Sinai, Moses stood between judgment and mercy and asked God to remember his name. In the far future that Ezekiel describes, God answers that prayer on a global scale. He remembers his name. He acts to protect it. And in doing so, he completes the plan that began when he first called Abraham and said, "Through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed." The blessing comes not through Israel's perfection, but through God's faithfulness. The nations learn who God is not because Israel preaches to them, but because they watch God judge, restore, and finally defend the people he chose to bear his name. The story is not ultimately about Israel. It is about the revelation of God's character to the entire world. And that revelation requires a people who survive long enough and visibly enough for the nations to see what God does through them.